he's also got a podcast called Pablo Torre Finds Out. It's welcome to the show, Pablo Torre.
Well, this is a little strange for me because I've heard you from afar for a while. So to be invited into what it is that you do, a real pleasure, I gotta say.
Well, this is sort of a cross-pollination, right? Like, our show usually covers politics, and I'm having you on because you have, in your podcast, broken a number of like bombshell news stories about the NBA and the NFL. And before, I should, as you're aware, our listeners are mostly gamers, nerds, they don't know ball. But before we get into the first story about collusion between the NFL Owners and Players Association, I'm just going to entice our listeners before they tune out that this story is not just about millionaire jocks and billionaire owners and sports ball. This story, by virtue of the people involved in it, will touch on mega government contractor and consulting firm Booz Allen, the Carlyle Group, who you may remember from such events as 9/11 and the Iraq War, and the cover-up of child sex abuse in Hollywood.
So there's that.
This story has many, many, many sort of tendrils to unravel. But at its heart, of what the story that you're calling Collusion Gate is fascinating to me because it really is a story that upends what you would expect from a players union and ownership, right? Like, this story really subverts what you would sort of expect to believe about how a players union would represent the interests of its members in contract negotiations with the ownership of these NFL teams. So there's a lot to unpack here, but like so many catastrophes in American life, this story begins with the Cleveland Browns. Could you talk about how, first of all, who Deshaun Watson is and why his contract with the Cleveland Browns sort of violated this kind of like cardinal sin or omerta among NFL owners?
Yeah. So I should be clear that my show is a technically sports show that is kind of like sport. I call it like sports I don't know how your mileage varies on the premise of liberal arts education, but to me, sports has always been that. And so the idea that we're going to get to all the things you mentioned, as well as some really, really strange and even darker other things potentially, it's by design. Like, my show is not really for, the standard ESPN consumer. It's for people who have a larger view on why, frankly, child molestation might be a thing we should be talking about in the context of very famous people who don't want you to know about it. And I mean that in a sincere way.
There's been a lot of that going around the news lately.
I dare say that in this case, some people have a point. Not all the people, but some of the people have a point. Deshaun Watson, to bring us back to sexual misconduct. So Deshaun Watson is the guy who is most famous for having dozens of lawsuits, civil suits filed against him because he loved getting massages, and the masseuses, subsequently, dozens of them reported that he was effectively sexually terrorizing them. And so in that regard, Deshaun Watson is a headline that came across in that police blotter sort of a way. But in this story specifically, he is also the guy who was given a contract that was truly unprecedented and unique in the modern NFL because he got more money guaranteed, hundreds of millions of dollars, by the Cleveland Browns, which is a violation of what teams like the Cleveland Browns and every other NFL organization wants to do. Because the NFL is a league, and this is the power dynamic between management and labor already sort of coming to the foreground here. It's a league that has been built on the premise that, yes, NBA players can have fully guaranteed contracts, which means whatever, something happens, they still got to get paid. Baseball, likewise.
The Mets still paying Bobby Bonilla to this day.
Precisely. There are teams, billionaires, haunted by the terrible decisions they made. And in the NFL, there are these outs. And basically, you just don't guarantee the contract, and suddenly that power dynamic is just pretty singular in American professional sports. All of which is to say that the Cleveland fucking Browns gave that guy, as aforementioned, star quarterback, a fully guaranteed contract. And the reason this set off alarm bells everywhere was first on the level of okay, this seems like the most cynical transaction in the history of professional sports. Fair, but also behind closed doors with these, again, the NFL is nothing but a wildly exclusive country club, with all of those teams representing these factions that are ostensibly competitors, but as this story will reveal, are cooperators, some would allege colluders. They all had the same reaction, which is apparently, this can never happen again. Not because of the moral reprehensibility, but because he got a fully guaranteed contract.
Or that he's a bad player or that was a bust anyway. No, it's because...
Correct.
Like in the NFL, because like there are so many injuries to players, from their perspective, ownership never wants to guarantee money in a contract and end up paying tens of millions of dollars to someone who doesn't play a single game because they get hurt. Because the NFL is just so much more violent than other professional sports. And
also they're cheap.
Yeah.
There's a desire to not want to have to do it, not having to do it. And then logically, yes, their argument is, by the way, like, this is it's a meat grinder in very real ways. But the point being that this takes us to what's happening behind closed doors, in which this is not merely a thing that you would think is so obvious that you don't need to reiterate it in any sort of like paperwork, because of course all the owners already feel this way. What happens, it turns out, is that it is written down on various emails and pieces of paper in ways that become relevant later.
And now, like, your story and your reporting begins with your basically disclosure of a 60-page legal document that was basically from like the NFL owners like a meeting in March of 2022, and like what is in that legal document, and that like what do those documents show?
Yeah, so the reason I became fascinated with this document is because there was a bit of for those NFL like legal heads, those nerds, there was this question of like, whatever happened to the time when the NFLPA sued the NFL for collusion against guaranteed contracts. So the NFLPA, the Players Association, had this attempt to hold the NFL accountable for things that will be very explicitly spelled out in this document. But the point is, this arbitration, and that's how it's settled in the NFL, arbitration, the ruling never got leaked. No one ever heard about it, which is conspicuous in a sport that loves leaks, and typically in a management labor squabble, right? Like one side will trumpet that they won and vice versa. So in this case, it was just dead silent in a way that became deafeningly loud. And so a couple people, Mike Florio at Pro Football Talk, notably, was like, can anyone help me find this document? And I said, I think I might be able to. I love finding out shit. And so this PDF, the 61-page arbitration ruling, what it revealed was what was described to me as the holy grail of NFLPA legal actions, which is to say that it turns out that in this arbitration proceeding, the NFL had to bring 8 of its owners, Roger Goodell, the commissioner, top executives in the league, as well as Ravens quarterback Lamar Jackson and Russell Wilson and Kyler Murray and all of these other NFL front office executives, and they had to testify. And not only that, they had to turn over their cell phones. So expedited discovery, the most terrifying
discovery
term.
Yeah. the thing everyone dreads in any sort of legal proceeding.
Yes, all of these billionaires whose entire like task for the league office is prevent us from having to give our cell phones to any sort of like legal process. They all had to do it. And so you get these transcripts, these emails, these slideshow presentations with notes written in the side, in which it becomes very clear that what Roger Goodell, the commissioner of the NFL, in communication with the NFL Management Council, and all I gotta know about that is that it's sort of like the, Mike Florio calls it a group that only exists to collude, but they're the group that is sort of like the nexus point on like best practices for all of the teams.
They ostensibly exist to advise ownership on what is the best practices for things like contract negotiations. But like, as you're reporting and like lays out, it's not really advice that you can just sort of consider. Like they like this management council, what they say really goes.
Yeah.
And like to example of the collusion that I wasn't aware of, or like what would be like at least circumstantial evidence of a case for collusion. It involves Lamar Jackson when he wasn't happy with his contract with the Ravens in 2022 and tested the open market and didn't get a single callback from any teams. Like, wait, what? This guy is a two-time MVP. And what the text show is that they're basically like owners talking to each other being like, hey, great job covering our ass on these contracts. You really made it easier for us. And it's just like the fact that the owner of the Atlanta Falcons would not reach out to Lamar Jackson about possibly him being a starting QB for the Falcons is insane.
No, they needed to have Desmond Ridder be the starting quarterback. So the reason this case was filed was because Lamar Jackson wanted a fully guaranteed contract after Deshaun Watson. Kyler Murray wanted a fully guaranteed contract after Deshaun Watson. Russell Wilson wanted a fully guaranteed contract after Deshaun Watson, and none of them got it. And the NFL Players Association had heard through its own networks that there were conversations among owners about how there was an effort to not give it out. Because it was like, oh, wait a minute, is the dam breaking? And so in these text messages, what you see and hear is that, yes, Lamar Jackson, multiple-time MVP, arguably one of the three greatest quarterbacks of his time, there is no offer coming in for that guy. And the linkage here, the dot to connect it is because all of the owners are hearing that they shouldn't make offers that are fully guaranteed anymore, and he's demanding it.
And what it shows is that the solidarity among the ownership of the NFL supersedes even their desire to win games or compete against each other on the football field.
Yes. This is part of why I love this story, is that it reveals what they actually care about. Because on the one hand, you might think that these guys are hyper-competitive championship trophy fetishists who will do anything like sign serial sexual misconductor Deshaun Watson to a deal. And in fact, the irony of how this all played out was that arbitration ruling revealed that no one even wanted to bid on the best quarterback available because more important was something that the NFLPA longs for and cannot seemingly have, which is organized and truly, I would say, staggering solidarity among the billionaires against the players.
You describe the NFL ownership as like it's all one big country club, and I think that's like these guys know each other socially. They sort of roll in the same circles, and they get to decide who gets accepted into the country club in terms of buying an NFL team or having an ownership stake in it. The fact that they would collude among each other is to basically get rid of guaranteed money in the NFL contracts for their players. That to me is a newsworthy story, but it's not exactly a shocking or groundbreaking story.
Yes.
Pablo, where this story gets really fascinating is why would the NFL Players Association, who have been vindicated by this legal arbitration and have like smoking gun evidence of leadership colluding against their members, against players in their contract negotiations, why would they then seek to keep this document secret and then basically everybody shut up about it? Like then we get into this idea of the leadership of the NFL Players Association being essentially controlled opposition for ownership.
It's the thing that was most eyebrow raising was like, wait a minute, this was in here the whole time. Why did no one ever know about it? And the way it happened was the NFLPA's leadership and the NFL's leadership agreed via confidentiality agreement to never talk about it.
Everyone involved in this meeting signed an NDA.
So the leaders of the NFL and the NFLPA both agreed, yes, via legal agreement, we're not gonna publicize this. And in fact, the people who were on some level the plaintiffs, right, the players in that arbitration case, they never saw the outcome. They never saw what happened when the arbitrator ruled in a partial victory in favor of the NFLPA with evidence that we've never seen before. That would be the number one thing you dream of if you were an NFLPA executive, a union official, trying to convince America. The way that I talk about those owners is actually rooted in reality, as opposed to what they claim is like the fantastical, hysterical whining of these spoiled millionaires. Like, actually, there's the proof, but it was never, of course, disclosed. And so the question of why gets to the controlled opposition point, which I think you can safely cut to the chase on at this point.
Okay, well, it involves two people, J.C. Treader and a man named Lloyd Howell, because at the exact time that this ownership meeting was taking place, the NFLPA had a turnover in their leadership. And I think one of the most interesting aspects of your story, or eyebrow raising to me, was the way in which the NFLPA went about sourcing new leadership for that NFL Players Association president position, or head of the Players Association position.
Yeah, so the regime that had filed the arbitration case alleging all the things that resulted in that hidden ruling, they were ousted. So that was DeMaurice Smith, who was a former prosecutor. Adversarial was his reputation among all of the people around the league and the union. And so the new regime that is installed, and J.C. Tretter was the outgoing president, the player president of the NFLPA, and he had a hand in figuring out who should replace DeMaurice Smith, the executive director. And the executive director job, for those not familiar, is like a forever job. Like a handful of guys have ever done it. You have the job for decades typically. And your job is to be the counterweight to the most powerful sports executive in America, the commissioner of the NFL. And in this case, what J.C. Tretter did was he engineered a process that was cloaked in an amount of secrecy that is comical, which we can talk about. But the basic philosophy that he had was, and this is something that I think is not uncommon, frankly, among various sectors of union leadership, depending on the industry and how much money is flowing through it. There is so much money in the business of football, which is accurate, that, this is the next step, we should just be partners as opposed to antagonists.
Right.
We don't need to be adversarial with the league. We're all going to make more money than we did before. Why shouldn't we just go along to get along and all get rich together? And so that philosophy was key to what happens next.
And like I'm thinking about that reflected in Lloyd Howell's statements first in an edited video clip, and then you uncovered the unedited video clip from his comments where he talked about how like today's players are different than in like back in the day, because like today's players they're entrepreneurially minded, and they're interested in capital and making their money work for them. And like, okay, so like, could you talk about who Lloyd Howell is, and just the unbelievably like bizarre star chamber process by which he was elected head of the NFLPA?
So J.C. Tretter, who is, by the way, a Browns offensive lineman, outgoing, one of his final acts in his position is to orchestrate a process via amendments to the union constitution, which require you, typically with 30 days notice, to tell the voters and the board of the NFLPA, or the 32 player representatives who decide in a democratic election who should be the new executive director. The Constitution used to require that you had 30 days to tell them who the candidates were. So J.C. Tretter and the executive committee, again, forgive the political sort of like org chart here, but J.C. Tretter and his inner circle of executive committee members vet and decide who the finalists for this job are going to be. And this job, by the way, it's multi-millions of dollars. This is it's arguably the highest profile, best paid labor leader job in America. So just as a context, like there's money in this job. You oversee $1 billion war chest. This is like not something you do as like a volunteer. Ooh, who are the good? I mean, typically you want the good guys, but this is something that you could do for incentives having to do with money. So they pick two finalists, one of whom is Lloyd Howell. And Lloyd Howell, because of this amendment to the Constitution, gets to walk into the room at which he is about to be voted on, and the voters will have no idea who he is until he says, "Hello, I'm Lloyd Howell, and I am a candidate, and this is what I do." What he is, and what unites the two finalists that J.C. Tretter selected for vote, is that he's a businessman. He had no union representative experience. He had no labor organizing experience at all. He had no sports experience. He wasn't a lawyer. He was, in fact, the former CFO of Booz Allen. And he happens to be, and this is something that would have been helpful to be told to the voters, you could argue, before they had to enter this room together. He was a character in what turns out to be one of the largest fraud settlements that a company has ever paid to the U.S. government, because under Booz Allen, according to a whistleblower who testified to this, Lloyd Howell was the guy she went to and did nothing. So that's the guy they ended up selecting.
The fraud settlement case, the fraud case that was brought against Booz Allen that they settled for something like $377 million, involved there are numerous contracts with the government of Saudi Arabia, which were all losing money for Booz Allen, and in fact was making the company itself in the red. And essentially what the whistleblower showed is that they were then taking money from contracts with the U.S. government, using them to backstop and make whole the contracts that they were losing money with Saudi Arabia.
Just standard NFLPA stuff, Everybody does that.
Okay, but like weird enough that this guy has no background in unions or sports or anything like that, and like his basically like the top line on his CV was CFO at Booz Allen while it presided over one of the largest fraud cases in U.S. history. But it gets even more insane when it turns out that he had an undisclosed conflict of interest involving the Carlyle Group and their attempts to get an ownership stake in NFL teams.
Yeah, the NFL did this thing, as sports is doing in general, where they give a short list of suitors permission to buy shares, to seek shares in NFL teams as owners. And this is new to sports, but Carlyle, private equity, they are on the list. And wouldn't you know it, but Lloyd Howell had a side gig as a consultant to the Carlyle Group while also seeking and receiving the job of being, as I said, the foremost counterweight and antagonist, ostensibly, to the owners who he is simultaneously working with through this arrangement at the Carlyle Group. So on its face, just patently ridiculous, but yet it also was not an issue until, it was reported by me and Don Van Natta at ESPN.
What? So like in this election process with it, like J.C. Tretter, the former player who created this like amendments to like essentially like be like I guess the equivalent would be like on election day you walk into the voting booth and you're like, here are the candidates you're voting for, decide now, you have 5 minutes. The question raised is like, why is the NFL Players Association creating a situation in which like their leadership and the people representing them in negotiations with management or ownership is someone who is like a house creature of ownership? Like does it benefit them individually, or is this part of, like you said, like a larger shift away in sports and American culture in general, away from this idea that there is an adversarial relationship between management and employees?
It's both. Individually for J.C. Tretter, like he wanted to be, this is in my reporting, he wanted to be eventually the executive director long term. Could not because of the way the timeline shook out. And so the theory was Lloyd Howell is a bridge candidate, a bridge quarterback on the way to getting the real starter in there long term, which would have been J.C. Tretter himself. And so he is, by the way, the possessor of one of the most invented titles in NFLPA history, which was Chief Strategy Officer, which Lloyd Howell gave him, making him one of the highest paid executives, and also the guy who actually knew about the union that Lloyd leaned on for all of his decisions, I am told. And so there is just that thing of the Game of Thrones that J.C. Tretter is trying to install himself long term. And then broadly, there is that trend in which, as you put it before, and as Lloyd Howell put it, like, we're all CEOs. We're all businessmen.
CEO at me.
Yeah, truly, everybody knows what it's like to be an owner now, so why don't we all treat ourselves like we're all on the same team? And that fundamental misunderstanding of A, not just the history of labor relations, but B, sort of the general rapaciousness of the people that they are specifically needing to counterbalance, because all of this, of course, is a negotiation, is just one of the more, this is just my now editorial position, having now studied this for the last year. It's just one of the more naive understandings of what the NFL is willing to do for you, because they're not going to do anything and they don't have to. And all of this is actually quite amusing to the people who you actually helped by burying the thing in the first place.
Have you noticed, or what do you make of since this story has broken? Maybe I'm wrong, but I have not seen too much reaction from current or former NFL players expressing any kind of outrage or even any opinion whatsoever on the collusion between their players association and the ownership of the NFL.
Yeah, and that's the third thing that's really important to mention, which is that the reason this can happen with one guy politically, strategically, as per his title, shaping an electorate and informing or under-informing them is because the NFL Players Association has one of the hardest jobs when it comes to organizing in labor relations in America. You have a union where ostensibly, by the way, Tom Brady's on the one hand, and on the other end of the spectrum is like a practice squad guy who's just trying to hang on. The, of course, revolving door of employment. And the average career length, is famously the shortest of all the major sports. And you have these guys who just don't actually share the same incentives. If you're thinking about organizing as employees buying in such that self-sacrifice can bolster a long-term strength, in the NFL, almost uniquely among sports, there is really no ability to think long-term. It's always, because of the injury risk and the meat grinder, it's always about the immediate near term. And so you have this body of players who just don't care nearly as much as you would hope they would from the perspective of what's it like to be the leader of their union.
Contrast that with the Major League Baseball Players Union, which is one of the most probably the most powerful in American professional sports. What accounts for that discrepancy? Because, I remember the other week there was a story about what's his name on the Phillies threatening to strangle
Bryce
Rob
Harper.
Manfred.
Bryce
Harper of the Phillies, basically if you come in our locker room talking about a salary cap in the Major League Baseball, we're gonna beat you up with bats right now. We're gonna do
I'm going to
practice on your
stomp
knees.
The commissioner of baseball. Yeah.
So that was Bryce Harper, big time Major League. He was basically threatening the commissioner of Major League Baseball if they even broached the idea of a salary cap. What accounts for this discrepancy in the bargaining power or relative union power of a sport like baseball to football?
It's a little too convenient for me to say guaranteed contracts, but it's not far off in terms of just the emblematic difference, right? So in baseball, you have long-term guaranteed contracts in which guys have some amount of security. Of course, you have the differences in terms of lifespan of careers. You also have, as a matter of just the lack of turnover in terms of just changing of teams, that is different. But also it's the history of the union. If you go back to Marvin Miller, who is the lion of sort of sports organizing, the MLBPA's former executive director, the late, great Marvin Miller, who wrote books literally about this. There is sort of an original sin of how the perspective is inherited over the generations between players. And baseball has a really strong history. I should say now, by the way, despite Bryce Harper's unilateral strength and desire to reorganize the face of Rob Manfred.
His strong negotiating position.
Yes. Despite that, they have their own issues relative to the days of Marvin Miller. So broadly also, labor unions in sports, I would say, are just weak right now. And it's because of the larger thing of we're all getting rich. Why do we really care as much as these crotchety old, former ghosts want us to?
And also, if you are a superstar athlete, the money you make on your contract negotiated with the owner of your team is really that's a little bit extra when the money you're really making is on endorsements, advertisements. Since these stories have broken, there has been movement here. Lloyd Howell has resigned. His position became untenable. What can you tell us about his resignation and then the subsequent, how weird the story gets even after that?
Yeah, so Lloyd Howell, who should have resigned for any number of reasons that already have been made clear to you and your
Sorry, I just want to bring up one more time the edited video that you have that you played on Pablo Torre Finds Out, where you found, was it the Florida Sentinel Post or something?
Yes, a local paper in Florida.
It had I have 4 views, and it contained his unedited comments in which he said, quote, there are some, quote, of investing in the NFL, quote, there are some very reputable firms in the mix. Do you think the Carlyle Group was among the ones he was thinking about?
Just a totally uncompromised opinion for a guy to have in that role. Look, the thing about Lloyd Howell was you can point to the fraud settlement at Booz. You could point to the side gig with Carlyle. You could point to the fact that he, again, suppressed via confidentiality agreement the holy grail for his union in an ultimate go along to get along move. You could point to any number of ways in which he was rank incompetent. And yet the thing that was the straw that broke his back was the fact that there were now in the sort of like chase for more Lloyd Howell details, documented receipts at Tootsie's, which you may recall as the largest strip club in America, in South Florida, where Lloyd Howell, by the way, Lloyd Howell was living. He was living in Miami and kind of in D.C., where the union actually is based, but he was living in a luxury apartment in Miami. And there are these receipts, and ESPN's Don Van Natta got them, where it was proven that the dude expensed the Players Association for like a 7-hour-long, I will editorially call it a bender. He might dispute that, but an odyssey at Tootsie's.
If you're spending 7 hours at a strip club, I mean, like, I don't know, the buffet maybe.
Yeah, but that was expense. The car was waiting. It took him it was airport Tootsie's home in the course of like 8 hours in the receipts. And so that seemed to be what was the last straw, but really it was the accumulated pressure and finally the exposure of like, so what's going on over there? And then shortly thereafter, J.C. Treader, the aforementioned chief strategy officer, who was, by the way, positioning himself to take over for Lloyd Howell in that resignation, once it happened, he also resigned because of pressure that was effectively put on him by the reporting I was doing, in which it was very clear that he was actually, if anything, the real brains behind how the union was making decisions around its behavior with the NFL.
So they were like, okay, Lloyd Howell resigns. That's embarrassing. You know, it was a screw up. He wasn't vetted properly. So then they're like, well, let's make sure the guy that comes in after him has a spotless record, and there's nothing there that could become potentially controversial or a problem for us. So that brings us to David White.
The runner-up. This is the other finalist that we teased earlier. The guy who didn't get the job.
He was sort of like the Judas goat that was put in there to be like the obvious wrong choice. To sort of like push everyone to like the preconcluded outcome of Lloyd Howell.
It's funny in the post-mortem to see all these people leaking. Like, no, at first it was no, we wanted the other guy, not Lloyd Howell. And now it's revealed that David White, the former head of SAG-AFTRA, himself, by the way, and there's so much
at least he has union experience.
So has union experience, and I think the key part, which we report too exhaustively for me to summarize here with you probably, his reputation entirely at SAG was as the pro-business candidate whose mentor was the guy who went from SAG to go run the studios, who in fact hired David White as a lawyer, as the counsel for SAG, to defend him when he personally, this guy, his mentor, was in his own scandal around, guess what? Having a quiet, secret side gig on the board of Netflix while being the head of SAG. So like that's David White. And that doesn't even get to the fact that he also effectively covered up a child molestation scandal that was exposed in a documentary called An Open Secret that pointed out with interviews on camera that SAG's effectively the face and the leader of their Young Performers Committee, which was for child actors, was himself a child predator with an admission on tape. And David White sent lawyers saying you can't mention SAG at all in this documentary, effectively trying to whitewash the reality of the organization that he was in charge of, which is to say, in many ways, we've buried the lead, but that's David White.
Well, I mean, is he currently in this position?
Yes.
I mean,
yes.
Okay, so like no changes there.
By the way, the reason I'm glad to talk about this is because I feel like I'm going insane. Like David White is still in charge of the union. The players, there are a couple now players who have sort of like raised their hand and said what's going, like Darrelle Revis has been like, what's going on here? And I'm getting DMs from some players and stuff. But genuinely speaking, like, it's the season. Guys are busy. They're trying to stay employed. Revolting against yet another executive director doesn't seem to be high on their list. I would say that if they got a ride in the car sometime, they should listen to the episode because it's not great for your union.
Well, I mean, like, yeah, this gets into like, I guess why I wanted to have you on, because like we see in this story like so many of the ways in which the world of sports and entertainment and politics like seem to kind of follow the same rules. There seems to be this bleed over in terms of how money and power really operates, and well, you know, surprise, surprise, it also touches on, you know, child sexual predators. But Pablo, I guess like one of the reasons sports fascinates me outside, you know, the competition and, you know, regional antagonisms and just talking shit to your friends, is that like I think it's like a canvas on which Americans can project and see reflected back to them their attitudes and anxieties about so much of American life, like race, gender, culture, as we talk about labor relations and class. But it's also like a universe of entertainment in which like people invest in it because the conflict that they see and the characters that they follow are governed by a set of rules that make sense, and everyone understands by them and plays by them. And like the universe in between the lines is like knowable to a certain degree. But like what your reporting seems to imply here is that like in like much of the rest of American life, money and power operate in ways that are different than we are all sort of encouraged to believe. So like, Pablo, what do you think that this story says more broadly about the state of labor relations, but also just American culture in general?
Yeah, so sports has never been more important, given the fragmentation of everything in 2025 in American life. It is the lone monoculture
it's like
we
the
got
last
left.
shared monoculture that we have, really.
It's the only place, plausibly, by the way, where people who consume nothing else in common might find each other rooting for the same thing and palpably experiencing an in-person thing that is, frankly, rejuvenating, given post-pandemic attitudes and all of that, right? So that's the promise of sports. The reality of sports, though, is that sports, for that same reason, has never had more money sloshing around it. And so the whole idea of, you know who also loves Saudi investment? Sports. Do you know who also loves a way to, I don't know, compromise the rules of what you would assume would be strictly enforced fair play? But the billionaires who in every other sector of their profession, of their day jobs, compromise that. And yet they do it, of course, as well in sports. And so for me, like the whole thing is never been more popular, never been richer. And for those same reasons, these owners, right, this new class of billionaire owner, I would say, even looking ahead, you have a bunch of guys who really do like sports, but they also are reckoning with the ways in which sports is governed by these ostensibly meritocratic rules and regulations that prevent them from simply buying the thing they want the most. They want to win. They want adoration, but there are these rules, salary caps and union regulations and elsewhere, that prevent them from truly using their money in the way that they think they should. And so that tension of humiliation is on the line if you lose, and yet they can't quite use their money in the way that they thought, it provides this like beautiful, fucked up petri dish for all of these big picture themes about what it's like to be in the United States right now.
Well, I often think like, you know, it's football season now, and like Sunday NFL football is like the secular church of America. When I think about everyone watching the games on Sunday, you're watching the games, you're enjoying them, but for most people, in the back of their mind, it's that Monday morning rolling around where you go back to work and you go back to working for your boss or having to earn a living. Through sports, how do you think that the American sports fan views the relationships between players and owners? Do you think that they see that as analogous to the relationship that they have to their boss and their working life, or do they see it as like a sort of as like people who have escaped that pressure of having to work for someone for a living?
You know, I think it's changed over time, because one of the big movements in sports and just like American life again has been like the rise of big data, the rise of like the moneyballization of everything, the rise of the front office in fantasy sports. And so I think it's interesting, right? Like you used to grow up, back in my day, you grew up wanting to be like a shortstop for the Yankees or whatever, a quarterback. And now I think people are fetishizing.
We're fantasizing about being an owner.
Yeah, man, they're fantasizing about being a CEO, an owner, most ideally. By the way, LeBron James himself, every player wants to be an owner in an unironic way, and every fan feels the same. And so in that regard, I think there's also just the historic, and this is a long-standing complication, right? Where if you're a fan, the owner stays, the players change. And these players, they seem to get all the girls. They're so rich. The idea that they would have complaints in any way makes them seemingly alien from a solidarity perspective as a worker. Right. And of course, the larger context, put it in a graph and see how much now you've learned something. I think if you don't care about sports at all, about like the relative power imbalance between even the most famous players and the worst owner, you realize that they're not on the same side of the actual economic aisle. It's quite different. So sports in that provides this window into caring and thinking about American labor relations, but through this funhouse mirror, where the question is, can you see yourself in these guys? And because we are fans rooting for laundry, and that laundry is embodied by this old motherfucker who's owned the team for 80 years, in which you seem to have aligned your desire to do this forever, and the players don't, as they move around and change teams, and player empowerment in scare quotes becomes a thing. It all is colliding right now in a way that, again, is messy. It's very messy.
And it's that people underestimate the gap between even 100 millionaire and billionaire. And I remember a long time ago, we had Bomani Jones on the show. And one thing he said that stuck with me is that given the value that he is worth, LeBron James is probably the most underpaid human being in world history. Yeah. And it doesn't seem that way. And he's not even complaining about because of all the endorsements or whatever, but the value that he creates for the ownership of a team with his labor, what he can do on the court, the attention he brings, the excitement, the fandom, he is blasphemously underpaid in terms of what his NBA contract actually is.
Oh, there's the convenient pro-billionaire socialism, which is, of course, reflected throughout politics now, that is clearly essential to how every collective bargaining agreement has been struck. And so, by the way, this extends to other stories that I'm currently swimming in with salary cap circumvention and why should you care about that and who's doing it. Spoiler alert.
Pablo, you've been snitching. Let's be honest here.
I've been accused of being a snitch, which is something that I genuinely think it's delightful for people to be so unfamiliar with investigative journalism that they just think that I am a snitch. And in that regard, and by the way, to that point, so this episode, which I won't even begin to get into because it's too long, but trust me, there's just a ton there if you're interested in the thing we just talked about. The story of Kawhi Leonard and Steve Ballmer, the richest owner in all of sports, former guy who ran Microsoft, obviously.
You may remember him from the famous Start Me Up Windows 98 video.
Yes, from the various pit stains and just truly unhinged sort of enthusiasms. That guy. The fact that I have been investigating how he has been circumventing the salary cap to pay Kawhi Leonard more and more and more money in a way that's unprecedented in pro sports. I understand if it may read in that 5-second summary, I am trying to get Kawhi Leonard paid less. I assure you that is not my intent. What I am doing is showing how the richest owner in all of sports is himself a character study in all of the psychologies I've mentioned, in which that guy will do seemingly anything to get the thing that he cannot buy for himself. And what does it say? That guy has been orchestrating, allegedly, per my reporting, the most unprecedented scheme to deceive the NBA in the modern era of sports. It all kind of fits together.
Just real quick, it's paying Kawhi Leonard $21 million under the table to plant trees. Am I getting that right?
$28 million. But also $20 million in equity in the tree brokerage. So 48 total on top of the max contract he signed. And my point being, though, I'm not snitching on Kawhi. I'm literally investigating the richest owner in all of sports. If that's actually why I'm interested in this, and I think that might now be clear based on the conversation we've had, but that's the person I'm actually afraid of in terms of how am I delicately reporting this story.
Given that the story we talked about does touch on, Booz Allen, the Carlyle Group, run by former presidents and former heads of the CIA, are you going to be the Michael Hastings of sports journalism?
Oh my
here?
God.
Is someone going to tackle you, Pablo?
Listen, tell the world my story. I am very happy. I have no thoughts that would indicate anything but a total contentment with my lot in life. I just ordered food that I plan to eat. You know, my belts are all, you know, I don't even wear them anymore, frankly. So,
well, I mean, you referenced it. I know you got to go. We don't have enough time to get into the Steve Ballmer, Kawhi Leonard
we could come back once I survive or not, and you can assess it.
It is, again, very, very funny and fascinating about, like the richest owner in all of American professional sports, circumventing the NBA salary cap to pay Kawhi Leonard to plant trees. There's too much there to get into.